merchants, right? So Israelis could, if there was something that didn't pass inspection, some food item or building materials, and you couldn't sell it in Israel, what did you do with it? You took it to the West Bank and you sold it in an open market there because there were no inspections there. We call that dumping, right? Dumping of second-rate goods, right? It's a kind of part of our relationship with countries like Jamaica now, right? The United States, where we dumped it, open market, kind of a neo-colonial relationship. It also began to bring in Palestinians workers. Palestinians were allowed to come into Israel to work. And about 100,000 people were working in Israel every single day in the most difficult jobs, the jobs the Israelis didn't want, in the building trades, in agriculture, and people working in the West Bank for Israelis. So if you wanted to get your car fixed in the 1980s or early 90s, Israeli, and you're in Tel Aviv, you don't want to go to a garage in Tel Aviv. You'll pay regular prices. It's expensive. So you drove into the West Bank, and you got it fixed by a Palestinian mechanic. Very cheap, right? You see here clothing textile workshops. Israel, a big part of the Israeli GNP, at least in the 80s and 90s, most of this is shifted to China these days, but was in the textile business, in clothing manufacturing, garment manufacturing. And most of the workshops, the sweatshops, were in Gaza and the West Bank. So it was designed in Tel Aviv, fabric cut in Tel Aviv, cut parts are sent to the West Bank where women assemble them like the maquiladoras of Mexico, and then it says made in Israel, and it goes back to Israel and is exported, right? So that was going on up the 1980s. They also put in new taxes and financial restrictions in this area. Another part of that internal colonialism was that they started to settle it. Now, at first, this was kind of a radical element because mainstream Israelis wanted to bargain with this territory and give it back in exchange for a peace treaty. But some said, no way. Some said this is a miracle. This was a divine miracle, this victory of 67. And this is the biblical heart this is the biblical land in the West Bank. That's where the Bible is really taking place, the Hebrew Bible. So they saw this as sort of a divine intervention, this victory, this miraculous victory, and they wanted to settle it. And that was kind of a radical element at first. By 1976, you only had about 3,000 settlers there, right? That's already 9 years into it. By 1987, by the 1980s, I'm not going to get all into Israeli politics if you have questions about it more, but Israeli politics started to shift, and new parties started to rise, and particularly Likud's victories in the 1970s, and the settler movement was a part of their coalition. And they lent support to settlement, and they made it easier for settlers, and settlement started to grow in the 1970s, and late 70s and early 80s. This situation in the 1970s and 80s, this internal colonialism, was something that Palestinians did their best to resist. Most of it was resisted by these leftist organizations who wanted to set up alternative government, right, and wanted to organize the agricultural sector and the educational sector and the health and welfare sector. And they became very activists, largely in a left-wing type of strategy, right? Go out and organize the people in these activities, get them to join the PFLP or the DFLP, and they began grassroots mobilization with a leftist sort of socialist bent. And it created this real sort of grassroots type of spirit in the territories. And in 1987, in December of 87, that take things into your own hands turned to militancy as well. Now, there had been militancy before, but in December of 87, it was inaugurated, in a sense, as an uprising called the Intifada. And so here you have pictures of what mostly the Intifada was, which was kids taking the situation to their own hands, young men mostly, who were going to confront the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force, in the territories by throwing stones, sometimes Molotov cocktails, but also by burning tires. It was largely stone throwing. And everyone my age, I'm 41 now, so you go back in that to the 80s, right, 20 years ago, and people who are teenagers, my cohort, especially there's just a couple years younger than me, They were the ones in the Intifada, right? And they were the ones out there and throwing stones. And those were the first group. This is when I started to hang out. I started to hang out, as I told you, 1988, before the end of this first year, and started to watch this Intifada. Wait a second. I put some things up here that, in this room, it's too hard for you to read. But it says there that the Palestinians, it wasn't just militant violence, it was also militant organizing. So they boycotted Israeli goods. So, you used to get day-old bread from Israel, and that's what everybody bought in the supermarket. And they said, no more bread from Israel. And women should start making their own bread and develop a home economy the way we used to be, and we should be independent and self-sufficient. And then no more Israeli cigarettes. You can't buy Israeli cigarettes. And young men would go by and they'd say, hey, you got a cigarette? And you took out, and it was a Marlboro or Israeli Time brand. They'd say, hey, what are you doing with those cigarettes? You should be smoking Imperials. That's the name of a Palestinian cigarette. But in every little part of life, there was an effort to kind of mobilize to resist Israel. Don't pay your taxes. Merchants shutting their doors to resist all different kinds of popular motivation, including these strike forces, and they went after Palestinian collaborators in a big way. Palestinians who had collaborated with Israel were murdered or chased out of town, and some people were seen as collaborators a little too quickly, in my opinion, right? Especially people who were involved with things that were seen as collaborating even if they weren't directly collaborating. So people who sold alcohol, people who were involved in prostitution or drugs, those things were seen as collaborating. And especially since Palestinians would say to me, hey, if you're running prostitutes or selling drugs, you must be doing it with the help of the Israeli police. Because they must have, they're letting you do it. They're making it possible. So you must be giving them something for it. So these people came under attack too. And there was a sort of purging of Palestinian society at this point of elements within it. And at this point, it's important to note that a second leadership emerged that really challenged Fatah in many ways. And that was Hamas, the Islamic resistance movement. And that emerged during the Intifada in the late 80s and early 90s as this parallel movement, as this parallel leadership, I should say. Israel responded to this with a heavy hand, with Yitzhak Rabin's line was, with broken bones, we'll crush this. And they used less, I would say, lethal, but sort of a mid-range lethal weapons to do it. They used batons, rubber bullets, tear gas, sound bombs, and a lot of arrests, right? And so I put here about 100,000 Palestinians detained, and many of them were tortured under interrogation. And that was like a kind of common ritual in the 80s and 90s. And the stuff we saw at Abu Ghraib, not the pornographic stuff, not the stuff that was peculiarly American, that pornographic element. But the other stuff, the hooding, the being forced to stand in positions for a long time, a lot of those, the softening techniques. We saw that all through the late 80s and early 90s. Human rights groups were all over it in the occupied territories. And guys my age, they have stories of that and what it did to them. And I've tried to write about that in different places, about what this torture was about, what these beatings were about, what they were trying to communicate between the Israelis and Palestinians, and how this shaped identity. The Intifada continued, and in some ways we could say it really started to end with the Gulf War. And I have a picture here of Israelis huddled in a bomb shelter with gas masks. They were getting, and here on the left, of course, that's Kuwait that was being destroyed by Saddam Hussein, the oil fields burning, and a destroyed Iraqi tank. But Saddam Hussein attempted to link Kuwait with the occupied territories. And he tried to say, you want me out of Kuwait? Get the Israelis out of the West Bank and Gaza. And of course, Palestinians were like, thank you very much. That's what we want to hear. You guys leave Kuwait, and we, the Israelis, leave here, and that'll be good. And so in that time together, when they didn't do that, Iraq also sent Scud missiles to Israel. And that's thus the Israelis with the gas mask. They feared chemical attacks. And Israel, this was a huge blow for both sides, okay? Israel had Scud missiles landing on it. And the military leadership, the government of Israel said, you know what? We got to reorganize this thing. We can't, this is bad, Scud missiles. We saw reports. Most of you were little kids, or if you were born yet. But I remember watching this on TV, and them talking about how the Patriot missiles were shooting down the Scuds and protecting Israel.